This is Intention to Treat from the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm Rachel Gottbaum. Today we're going to talk about research that reveals that many patients considered to be in a coma or vegetative state and who are unresponsive may actually be conscious and aware.
My name is Nancy Worthen, and my daughter Margaret had a severe brainstem stroke when she was 22 years old. The doctor said, she's in a vegetative state, and we think you should let her go. Because she was on a ventilator and then a feeding tube in order to keep her alive. And the doctor who was in charge felt she wasn't ever going to progress. They did some things about asking her questions to see if she would respond. They touched her toe, pinched her to see if there was a response, different tests, and she wasn't responsive. But, this is like 2 minutes, a test of very short nature with a stranger. So even though they weren't giving us a lot of hope, we decided to give her a chance of more time to recover. She had everything going for her. She is young, she's athletic, she's healthy. She was going to graduate from college in a week and a half. She was brilliant. She had a plan, and she was a fighter. So I didn't see that she would want me to give up when I knew that she wouldn't give up. What we ended up doing is we got her into Spaulding Hospital, and they had an 8-week program where they had a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, a physical therapist. They were moving her arms. They were putting something in her hand and having her comb her own hair. They kept testing her in that same way, pinching her to see what her brain state was, but she didn't respond. But even at the very beginning, when her boyfriend would come, it seemed like she knew he was there. He would tell her totally like inappropriate jokes. He'd make fun of people, and she responded with a "ah" that was kind of like a laugh, like she got it. And then my partner was taking her for a walk in a wheelchair, and he was saying, "I hope it won't always be like this." And she sobbed, just like, "Oh." Again, a sound that was a communication. So she was in a nursing home, and she needed 24-hour care, but I wanted her to see a neurologist. And I found someone I thought was really an expert and had treated people in a similar state. So we bring Margaret in on a wheelchair, and a doctor comes to her and just says, "I know you're in there, Margaret. I know you're listening." And then he takes out his license, and he just lifts her upper eye, and he takes the card and he says, "Can you follow this with your eye?" And she does. Then he decides, let's use this for yes and no. So for no, move your eye down. And for yes, move your eye up. So he asked her, "Is your name Louise?" She said no with her eye by moving it down. And then when he said, "Is your name Margaret?" she moved it up to say yes. So it was like she knew what he was saying. She could answer. When she got back to the nursing home, the speech therapist and I worked out a whole thing with using eye movement. We had a whiteboard and they would ask her questions and she could read. Do you want to go outside or do you want to watch a movie? And so she'd get to choose what she was going to do with her eyes. To be able to just have a choice in your day for someone who had no choice at all because I'm making choices for her, or the nurses are making choices for her, or the doctors are making choices for her. I had a beach house and we would have some friends visit there. Like I could plan something with her. Instead of me saying, well, let's go to the beach, I could say, would you like to see your friend Michaela? She usually said yes because she wanted to go out somewhere. Besides communication with the eye movement, in the fMRI, we found out that they could ask her a question and they would see the response in the pictures of her brain. And all of her brain activity responses were the same as what a normal person or what I would do if I were asked the same thing in this fMRI. I mean, a vegetative state is a lot different than someone who can respond to all these things. So basically, they were saying that your daughter is conscious. She still had a feeding tube because the problem with swallowing is she would aspirate and then she'd get pneumonia. She moved into a group home, which was another one of my goals, instead of a nursing home, for people that needed 24-hour care, but where she got intellectual stimulation. They had like a civics class, and then there was an art class. But what it also did is that it exposed her to more people, and she got pneumonia. Now, this is 9 years after she had her stroke. So she was 31, and she was just having trouble recovering because she's not as healthy, she's not as conditioned. It was just really hard for her to recover. She knew that she was dying, and she accepted that she was dying. And so we asked her, do you want to be home? You're going to be on hospice, and you may die from this pneumonia. And so she decided that she wanted to be back at the place that she lived. And so we took out the intubation. We didn't trach her, and people had a chance to say goodbye to her, and they got to see her before she died. She could make choices at the end of her life that were significant choices. I could have made them for her, and I don't know what I would have chosen because I really wanted her to choose, and she did. And I'm so proud of her.
Margaret Worthen died on August 2nd, 2015. Her mother says she is grateful that her daughter was kept alive and that they were able to communicate. This is Intention to Treat from the New England Journal of Medicine. We're now joined by Dr. Yelena Bodian. She's an assistant professor at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital, and also Dr. Michael Young. He's an associate director of the Center for Neurotechnology and Neurorecovery at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Bodian, I want to get into your study and what it found, but let's start with the people you've been studying. These are unresponsive patients. Describe what that means.
People who are unresponsive at the bedside as a result of a brain injury, in other words, people for whom if you ask them to follow a simple command such as opening and closing their hand or answering a prompt, they're unable to do that at the bedside. But when you assess them with functional neuroimaging, we can see that approximately 1 in 4 people are actually able to have complex thinking patterns and complex cognitive abilities, even though you really aren't able to detect that on a standard clinical bedside assessment.
1 in 4, that's a lot.
This is referred to as cognitive motor dissociation. And this is a phenomenon that we need to recognize exists, and we need to be able to identify it in patients who are unresponsive at the bedside and ultimately develop protocols to treat and to help these patients so that we can establish systems of communication with them and understand their preferences and return their autonomy back to them.
How did you test these people? What did you see that establishes awareness, consciousness, thought?
The way that we assess for cognitive motor dissociation is through functional magnetic resonance imaging. And the second way that you can look at this is through electroencephalography, so EEG. And while people are being assessed with functional MRI or with EEG, we ask them questions such as, imagine that you are playing tennis. Now stop imagining that you're playing tennis. Or you can say, imagine that you're opening and closing your right hand. Now stop imagining that you're opening and closing your right hand. And you can contrast the brain response when they are asked to think about something or to imagine something with the brain's activity when they're asked not to do that. And you can see how the brain responds to a command, even though this is somebody who would not be able to open and close their hand at the bedside, would not be able to show you how to play tennis at the bedside. They can think about those things, and we can detect that on functional MRI and on EEG.
So who are these patients? What have been their diagnoses, and what did we think before?
The patients, the participants in this study, some have an acute brain injury, which means that they've had their brain injury for less than 28 days. And some people have a chronic brain injury, which means that it has been going on for more than 28 days. Some people have a traumatic brain injury, which means that it's something like a car accident, a direct trauma to the brain. Some participants had cardiac arrest, so blood flow stopped to the brain. And so what is common to them is that they have a behavioral diagnosis of either coma, which means that they are both unresponsive and unaware of their surroundings, or they're in a vegetative state. And that means that at some times during the day or at night, they do open their eyes, but they don't respond to questions. They don't track visually somebody moving around the room. They don't localize a painful stimulus on their body. They're awake at times, but completely unaware. Or some of the patients have a slight amount of awareness. So this is called the minimally conscious state minus. So they have a lower level of consciousness. Their eyes might be able to follow somebody around the room, or if they feel something painful, bring their arm over and push that painful stimulus away. But the key is that they are unable to follow commands. So every single person in that study, when we get that 25%, that 1 out of 4, out of that group of people, every single person is unable to follow commands at the bedside when you ask them to do so. They do not wiggle their toes. They do not speak when you ask to speak. They do not give you a thumbs up. They look like they don't respond to any verbal spoken question. And to know that 1 of 4 people who can't do that, who don't do that, when you ask them to do it at the bedside, can generate the brain response to suggest that they actually have that capacity.
So, Dr. Young, you treat brain-injured patients every day. What do you see as the implications of this research?
This research adds to a growing body of evidence that a substantial portion of patients who appear unresponsive after brain injury may in fact harbor covert consciousness that evades bedside detection. Traditionally, our clinical categories, such as the vegetative state, minimally conscious state, coma, have relied on behavioral criteria of assessment. And the fact that our assessments figure so prominently in decisions to limit or continue treatment speaks to the importance of this kind of research, bringing clarity to how to approach these kinds of assessments in a rigorous, precision manner that goes beyond what clinicians might be able to observe at the bedside.
Dr. Bodian, what's missing here, and what does your study show is missing?
So to me, the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that how we have been measuring consciousness and how we have been thinking about who is conscious, at least in the medical context, has always been anchored to a subjective, overt behavioral response. But consciousness, it's an internal response. It's an internal feeling of awareness. We can all be conscious without showing that we are conscious. And now we have the tools, fMRI, EEG, and others, to actually assess that internal subjective state. So I think once there is a recognition that when we think of consciousness, we see just the tip of the iceberg when we do the behavioral assessment. What is below the surface of the water, our own internal experience of the world, is what we are trying to assess with these tools, because that's when you really can understand somebody's internal state. And that's when you can really understand the level of brain function that has been either retained or recovered after a severe brain injury.
So, Dr. Young, many of these kinds of patients you follow and treat, some have been designated in a coma or vegetative state, and patients with cognitive motor dissociation. What is happening for them after their initial diagnosis in an acute setting?
We've learned that many patients are incorrectly labeled as unconscious, either due to inadequate behavioral evaluation or because they're covertly conscious without any behavioral markers of awareness. And in my experience, patients not only are at risk of underdiagnosis and underdetection with respect to how conscious they might be, but furthermore, it is not common for these patients to be followed long-term where their emerging capacities can be tracked and rehabilitation strategies offered.
So why aren't these patients being followed?
Some are, but in most places around the world, after a patient presents to the hospital with their acute brain injury, they typically receive intensive treatment in the ICU, followed by typically a period on a neurology or general medicine floor before they go to rehab, if they're lucky to get into rehab. And after that point, many patients are lost to neurology follow-up and receive custodial type care in skilled nursing facilities. There are not enough neurorehabilitation clinics devoted to following these patients over time, to tracking their recovery, and to guiding these patients and their families to ensure that these patients get the care that they deserve.
So, Dr. Bodian, help us understand the process and why many of these patients fall off the radar.
Imagine a patient who goes into the acute care, into the ICU, into the ward, where the focus is really on providing life-sustaining treatments and critical care and making sure that this person is alive at the end of their treatment. After they are discharged, the overwhelming majority of patients do not go to rehabilitation facilities. The reason for that is that the policies of our healthcare system here in the US is a patient must be able to participate in 3 hours of intensive rehabilitation in order to gain admission to an inpatient rehab facility. Most patients who have a severe brain injury and have a disorder of consciousness are deemed to be unable to, and I put here in quotes, participate in an intensive rehabilitation program. And typically that boils down to, can they do things? Literally, can they do things when you ask them to do things? Can they participate in a bathing, in a grooming activity? Can they stand? Can they walk? If they can't do those things, they're not eligible for inpatient rehabilitation. So then they get discharged to a skilled nursing facility, a nursing home, or sometimes even directly home. Now, at that point, they very often have incredible barriers to being able to get back to a hospital that can give them an assessment.
So even if these patients can get to a hospital for that assessment, there are still other obstacles, aren't there? And also, as you've noted, even this estimate you've given, 1 in 4 brain-injured, unresponsive patients may be conscious and aware, is actually an underestimate. Can you explain that?
So patients who appear unresponsive, their level of consciousness and their brain state fluctuate over the course of a day, over the course of a couple of days, over the course of months. And so even with a standardized behavioral assessment, so when you ask, very specific questions in a specific order, a specific number of times, and everybody does it exactly the same way, within even a 2-week period, you need at least 5 assessments to be able to capture the person when they are at their best to detect that they are conscious. And you can imagine if it can change that much over 2 weeks, how much it can change over a month or more. And so with our fMRI and our EEG tests, we didn't have the luxury of assessing people over and over and over again. These are highly resource-intensive tools. So our numbers probably, if we could assess people 5 times, 10 times over the course of several weeks, would be higher. And just to give you one concrete example, some people were assessed only with EEG. And some people had both an fMRI test and an EEG test. And in those people who had both tests, the rate of detecting cognitive motor dissociation was higher than in people who had one test or the other. And what that tells us is that we do need to assess people multiple times over large time spans, and we need to do it using every tool that we have at our disposal, because each tool is measuring something that's a little bit different. Just like the behavioral assessments measure something different from the functional MRI measures something different from the EEG.
So moving forward, what's possible here? What do we think we're going to be seeing in the future now?
I would say systematic surveillance of patients with severe brain injury as they transition out of the intensive care and the acute care hospital and into either rehab, nursing home, or to their home, developing a way of keeping in touch with them to determine level of consciousness or change in function over time. It could give us a very good sense of how people are recovering in large, prospective, consecutively assessed cohorts.
And then also communication, as we saw in that young woman, Margaret Wortham, who was able to use eye movement to communicate.
Absolutely. And so where we're hoping we can go next, now that we have established this phenomenon exists, to be able to develop tools that would allow us to convert into systems of communication, which requires an extensive amount of both human resource power and technological advancement to make that actionable.
So what is the take home for both of you with this research and the work you do?
In the days to weeks after a severe brain injury, the degree to which any one person will recover and when that recovery will happen is incredibly low. And so all of our data that we have collected over many, many decades about severe brain injury has still resulted in a very low certainty. So physicians, they just can't know for sure who is going to recover, to what degree, and when that recovery is going to happen, and whether or not that recovery will be acceptable.
Are you saying that the status quo is that often life-sustaining treatment is withdrawn? What are you talking about here?
Early after severe brain injury, if somebody does not recover consciousness, if somebody does not recover the ability to follow commands and to express themselves, the question about whether or not to continue or to withdraw life-sustaining treatment comes up. And the reality is that we don't have great data to say to one individual person that at 6 months post-injury, they are going to be able to communicate. And by 12 months post-injury, they're going to be able to enjoy their leisure activities. And by 18 months post-injury, they might be able to travel and do many things that they used to do before outside of the home, but they're not going to go back to work. That's the level of information that families often want. And so the decisions about withdrawing life-sustaining treatment early on are made in an environment where there is just simply a lack of information.
Dr. Young?
There's often great ambiguity early on, especially in acute and subacute phases after brain injury, what the future might hold. And we need to approach these kind of decisions and discussions with humility. We need to follow these patients over time to understand the natural history of these enigmatic states and how to optimally approach treatment and supporting recovery. As a clinical community and as a society, we should democratize access to the techniques that we know help ameliorate the uncertainty and bring clarity to these tragic decisions and discussions.
Thank you both so very much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much.
That's Dr. Yelena Bodian. She's an assistant professor at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital in Boston, and also Dr. Michael Young. He's an associate director of the Center for Neurotechnology and Neurorecovery at Massachusetts General Hospital. We had help from editors Dr. Alan Roper and Dr. Patrick O'Malley, and producer Bridget McCarthy. Our managing editor is Deborah Molina, and our engineer is Adam Strauss. This is Intention to Treat from the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm Rachel Gottbaum.